Our Old Testament reading for this morning comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." This is the word of God for the people of God. Well, this is awkward. I know. You're probably thinking, did we really mean to read from that part of Matthew earlier? Well, it's the part of the lectionary passage for this week, believe it or not. It's an odd thing, isn't it, that here we are at the beginning of Advent, at the beginning of a new year in the lectionary calendar, actually, and we're reading about apocalypse, the beginning of the end, so close to Christmas, it just doesn't quite seem to fit. But believe it or not, that's one of the things that I love most about this time of year. There is a tension. There's a sense of expectation, eagerly awaiting for the arrival of Jesus. Of course, for us, we know that arrival happens in just a few weeks when shepherds will gather, angels will sing, and the Christ child is born once again to two poor parents in a Bethlehem stable. But what about the other arrival? Not the first coming, but the second. That's what Advent also calls our attention to, as Jordan has shared with us from our children's sermon. Advent directs our attention to the skies. It's why I'm wearing a bright cobalt blue, not Carolina blue. Just want to clarify that. That's the color of the stole today and throughout the season of Advent. Blue is the color of hope, of anticipation. It's December already, but we're still a few weeks away from the comfortable images of the Christ child in the manger. None of the examples that Jesus gives in Matthew are very comfortable, are they? What's clear from Jesus as he shares what he knows about his return, which isn't much, is that it will be when we least expect it. Here are a few other ways we might think about the unexpected return of Jesus. I read a story by a father named Rick last week. And Rick writes, "I was sitting on the couch watching TV. Who knows what great and inspiring program I was zoning out to, when my wife yelled from upstairs, 'Rick, Rick!' 'Yes,' I said, rather annoyed that she hadn't had the grace to wait for a commercial break. 'My water broke.' Whoa! In milliseconds, I went from couch potato to man on fire. I had a zillion things to do to get my wife and myself in the car and begin making the hour drive to the hospital. We were having a baby, and we were having it now. Moments later, she calmly entered our laundry room where I was frantically shoving whites, colors, and darks into the washer, completely indiscriminately. What are you doing? She asked. I'm doing laundry. I need some things cleaned before we go off and spend a couple of days in the hospital. There was deafening silence, followed by, Rick, you do not have time to do laundry. We need to go, now. It was our first child, and I was unprepared. I was unprepared in terms of clean clothes, and I was unprepared for how real things were about to get, and how quickly those things were about to become real. If I hadn't had the foresight to wash my underwear an hour previous, I was just going to have to go with what I had. And that was that. Jesus, in the apocalyptic section of Matthew, tells the disciples that they need to be ready, awake, and vigilant. Not like Rick. Not to be caught off guard by a thief in the night is another example that Jesus gives, which reminds me of a time in Edenton when I was safely home for the evening. I was watching a football game or a show on Netflix from my couch, probably thinking about my calendar for the next day, when, wham, there was a slam at the front door. And just a few seconds later, another bam by my dining room window, which was not far off the ground. And of course, my porch light was out, so I couldn't see anything in the pitch black outside. So I reached for my closest form of defense, an official Patrick Cardwell Louisville Slugger. And I frantically dialed 911 and explained that I thought my house was being broken into. 3 minutes later, a police car pulled up and an officer knocked and introduced himself. I nervously opened the front door for Officer Brown, and he said he would do a check of the property. I watched from inside as the white beam of his LED light swept all across my yard. After a few minutes, he came back to the front porch and reported his findings. No vandal, no burglar, but he did see 2 feral cats locked in the heat of battle and some light scratch marks on my siding near the front door. It wasn't a person at all, he chuckled. Probably just those 2 cats battling it out, and their skirmish landed at my front door, quite literally. The threat wasn't real, but the feeling of alertness certainly kept me awake until the wee hours of the morning. That's the kind of watchfulness that Jesus calls us to. And if we take his words literally, then his return will be marked by people who are taken suddenly and people who are left. I recounted a story from Jackie Tanzier at Hilda Ferguson's funeral 2 weeks ago about the second coming. Once, Gene, Hilda's husband, was driving his family in their car. Hilda was in the passenger seat, and Jackie was in the back seat. Hilda was firm on many pillars of her faith, including the virgin birth. But Gene wasn't quite so sure about that one. Hilda said, "Now, Gene, you have to believe in all of it, including the virgin birth, or you won't go to heaven. If Jesus came back right now, those who believe will be snatched away with him, and those who don't will be left behind." Putting the theological pieces together in her head from the back seat, 6-year-old Jackie leaned forward and said, "Dad, I'm sure glad you're driving instead of Mom." But really, I hope those stories and situations help us to focus on what Jesus is actually saying in Matthew. Jesus himself doesn't know the time of his arrival. It's unexpected. There were real concerns in the early church about when Jesus would come back. And I don't think we're all that different. In the year 999, churches all across Europe were convinced that Jesus would return, holding midnight mass together to greet Jesus and the end of time as they worshiped on New Year's Eve. The clock struck midnight. The priest held his arms wide to embrace eternity, and, of course, things kept moving on. There are many days that have come and gone in the prediction of Jesus' arrival. Y2K, 2012 with the completed recordings of the Mayan calendar, the lunar eclipse of 2015, and even as recently as this past Pentecost. And as much as we wait for Jesus, as much as we look for him and watch, Jesus isn't asking us to predict when. Maybe it's better that we don't know. Jesus doesn't know, and he doesn't ask us to know. I think it's because we are not expected to know everything, but we are expected to do something. The Jesus of these verses before us calls persons to a life of work in a spirit of wakefulness. Work means that we are active here and now. Biblical faith, as Jesus envisions it, is not so concerned with otherworldly matters that it neglects this world's affairs. Jesus in Matthew has an eye on what is to come and believes that something decisive is going to happen in the future, but he keeps attention focused on the present day and the needs of the hour. We find this in the ways that he directs people and he teaches about situations in the field, in the mill, in the daily grind, the ordinary places where life is lived. The mundane is where faithfulness happens, and it is not to be neglected. Human striving toward biblical faith recognizes that we do not know everything, but we do know we are called to do something here and now. That's what it means to be the church in the in-between of Jesus' first and second coming. And at the core of our work and ministry together is the stubbornness with which we cling to hope. We are called to the work, but work will not do everything and cannot do everything. Hope will come. The deepest, the best, and highest form of hope shall come, not from our work, but from somewhere outside it and beyond it. That is the promise of Christ's return. Not fear that accompanies its unexpectedness, or worry about the fact that we don't know when it will happen. The promise of Christ coming again in the clouds is the same promise that we will celebrate here in a few weeks. It's the promise we remember in lighting our first candle of Advent. It's the promise, the assurity, the unwavering beauty of hope. One theologian writes, Christians understand that this promise is extended to them through Jesus Christ. For them, too, God will bless the church to be a blessing to all people, and God will be faithful to the church for the sake of God's own mission. For many congregations and denominations that are declining in numbers, this is a genuine word of comfort and hope, that God is not done with us yet. Advent hope is not a yearly exercise of playing pretend. Instead, Advent hope is fully aware of what was, of what is, and of what is to come. When we see the world around us in chaos and disarray, when we look to the skies and wonder what our faith is really about, when we keep showing up on Sundays and keep coming back to this place to do the work of God as disciples of Jesus, we are choosing to be stubborn in hope, patiently awaiting the coming day when those hopes are realized. Mary Oliver gives voice to that same thought in her poem, Winter Hours, where she writes, "Hope, I know, is a fighter and a screamer." That stubborn hope that fights and screams is what we find from the prophet Isaiah as well. Isaiah holds up a vision of the true hopes of the world. Isaiah takes us to a mountain and he shows us what our hearts are actually tuned for. God will reign and will judge between the peoples. God's house will be established, and we will be drawn to it across lines of race, nationality, and language. We will strive toward it together to be taught and to be changed. An eternal ceasefire will be announced, and the transformation of weapons made for conflict into tools for co-creation. What's even more compelling about Isaiah's vision is how countercultural it sounded to a people who had strayed far from God, a people who were surrounded by unfaithfulness and violence. That sounds as much like us today as it did for Israel then. As much as we may long for a day when weapons are laid down, when hearts are transformed and peoples are drawn together, sometimes we find it hard to believe that such a day will actually come. Even to speak of the end of time or of a time beyond time when God will set everything right is a stretch for many of us. Isaiah's vision may be even more preposterous than that, because he announces that this remarkable transformation will take place in days to come. In days to come. That may not be specific, but it does make clear that God's day of restoration is on the horizon. In this season of Advent, we prepare our hearts for the coming of Christ, and we prepare our homes for the coming of family, of friends, and the shopping season. Isaiah challenges us to remember where our hope is and what we're really preparing for. It's so much easier to pin our hopes on Christmas gifts and holiday feasts than it is to open ourselves to the possibility of believing in the seemingly impossible vision of another outcome for the world. We have been disappointed so many times by failed peace treaties abroad and by divisions within our own culture, within our own churches, and by fractured relationships in our own lives. We know the destruction that conflict causes, even if we have never lifted an actual weapon. In fact, it's this passage of Scripture that inspired Christian activists Shane Claiborne and Michael Martin to begin a new project. It's called Beating Guns. In the wake of so many shootings across the United States, Shane and Michael invite people to contribute their guns to the project. Michael is a metal worker who chops guns up and transforms them into garden tools. Michael says, the tools are being donated to somebody who shared their story with us, or to local community gardens, or the church or person that donated the gun. So they're staying in the community that they came from. It's an offering, an attempt at the peace that more fully realizes Isaiah's vision in chapter 2. Now please don't hear this as my personal cry for national or personal disarmament, or as any particular political statement. That's not what this is. The work that Shane and Michael carry across the nation is just one alternative to the way things are. With the voice of Advent, Shane says, we are a hopeful people. We're people of faith who believe that life is more powerful than death and that love is more powerful than hatred. We try to speak with a prophetic voice and remember that that prophetic voice is positive. It's a vision committed to turning tools of death into tools of life. Shane and Michael have caught sight of Isaiah's vision and are trying a new way forward for our communities and for the world. In the end, what Isaiah offers is not only a vision of global transformation, but an invitation to live toward that day. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. However hard it may be to believe that a new and longed-for reality will take hold someday, there is power in walking in God's light now, one step at a time. Sometimes we may feel cynical or hopeless about the probability of Isaiah's vision. But in his invitation lies enormous and practical power. The future belongs to God. But the first step toward that future belongs to those who have glimpsed God's light and are willing to trust that enough light lies ahead. Because it seems to me that you and I are the ones who are responsible for being the light in the world. If our world is one where injustice and violence and oppression and suffering thrive, at this time of the year when we look forward to something better, I think we have to ask ourselves whether we are contributing to that suffering or whether we are living as the hope that God has brought into the world. From the unexpected nature of Jesus' coming to Isaiah's radical vision of days gone by, there are still days to come. So in those days, what are we doing as we await for Jesus to arrive? Are we merely looking to the skies and biding our time? Or are we people who walk in the light, people who point others to God's ways and prepare for the coming of Christ? In this season of preparing and waiting, let us remember together to shine light to the world that we're in, while living like the next world has already come. Through our faith, our expectation, our Advent hope in Jesus, may it be so. Amen.